Rain fell in white sheets over the outskirts of Detroit when Caleb Turner pulled to the shoulder where an old woman stood shivering beside a dead Cadillac. He only meant to help and go. But the moment he lifted the hood, his hand froze. The wiring had been cut clean sharp, precise enough to chill the blood, not a breakdown. Someone had done this. Hours later, powerful CEO Madeline Whitmore called her voice hard, accusing him of touching her mother's car. Caleb only answered soft and low, "Someone just tried to kill her." The garage sat at the end of a cracked lot on the wrong side of Detroit, a low building with a rolling steel door that never quite closed straight. Caleb Turner had learned to live inside its noise, the hiss of the compressor, the tick of cooling engines, the drip from a roof he could not afford to fix. He worked with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and his hands permanently darkened at the knuckles, and most days that was enough to keep the past where it belonged. Most days, there had been a time when his name meant something in the industry. Years before, Caleb had been a lead diagnostic engineer, the kind of man they flew across the country to solve the problems no one else could name. He could read a vehicle the way a doctor reads a body, could find the one failing line in 1,000 miles of code. Then a data leak scandal had landed on him like a dropped engine block files he never touched. Evidence he never planted a story too clean to have been an accident. By the time he understood he had been framed, the career was gone, the reputation was gone, and the only thing left was a set of tools and the knowledge of how to use them. So he opened the garage. He fixed transmissions for men who paid late and heaters for women who could not pay at all, and told himself it was honest work, which it was. What it was not was safe. A folded notice sat on the workbench under a wrench, the landlord's third warning the rent months behind. The lot would be repossessed if he did not find money he did not have, and Caleb had stopped pretending he would. Some nights he simply stood in the open doorway and watched the rain come down and waited for a future that never arrived. On the other side of the city, in a glass tower that caught the last gray light of evening, Madeline Whitmore was learning that being right was not the same as being trusted. She ran Whitmore Motors, the company her father had built, and she ran it well, but the boardroom still looked at her the way they had the day she inherited it. Too young, too sharp a founder's daughter playing at a founder's job. She had answered them the only way she knew how, by controlling everything, trusting no one, carrying the weight alone until her shoulders had learned the shape of it. The lesson she had taken from her father's death was simple, and cold trust was the opening through which people put the knife. The company was weeks from launching Aurora X, a self-driving line worth billions, the project that was supposed to prove the doubters wrong and put her name beside her father's for good. Everything she had was riding on it. So when her phone rang that night with news of her mother stranded on a rain-soaked road outside the city, the fear that moved through Madeline was not only a daughter's. It was the fear of a woman who had begun to sense, without yet being able to name it, that something around her was moving in the dark. The old woman by the Cadillac was Eleanor Whitmore, and she was more than the mother of a CEO, though Caleb had no way of knowing that as he crouched in the downpour with a flashlight in his teeth. What most people also did not know was that Eleanor had built Whitmore Motors alongside her late husband, that she still held a founder's block of shares and a board seat she almost never used. She had stepped back years ago and let the world forget her, which suited her fine. That night, though, the world had forced her to remember she existed in the form of an engine that had died all at once on an empty stretch of road. Caleb had only stopped because no one else would. He pulled his truck onto the shoulder, told her to sit inside where it was dry, and opened the hood expecting a loose battery cable or a fouled sensor, the ordinary failures of an old car. That was not what he found. The wiring in the engine bay had been cut, and not by accident, and not by wear. The cuts were clean and deliberate, placed exactly where a fault would look like a fault, hidden from anyone who did not know precisely where to look. His stomach turned over. He had seen work like this before a long time ago, and it had cost him his life as he knew it. He did not tell her that. He worked in silence for a while, splicing what he could, restoring enough to get the Cadillac running again. And when Eleanor tried to press folded bills into his hand, he closed her fingers gently back over them. "I don't want your money, ma'am," he said. "I want you to take this car somewhere and have every inch of it checked. Tonight, if you can." She studied him with a directness that surprised him, an old woman reading a younger man, and finding, apparently, that she approved. They talked while they waited for the worst of the rain to pass. She asked about the garage, about how a man with hands that careful had ended up on a road like this one, and Caleb gave her the short, worn version he gave everyone. But Eleanor listened differently than most. She did not look at him with pity, the way the world had learned to look at him, and she did not look away. She looked at him the way people had once looked at him, when his name still meant something. And though he could not have said why that steadiness stayed with him long after her taillights disappeared into the dark, she would remember him too. She made a point of it. The call came near midnight. Caleb was scrubbing his hands at the utility sink when the phone lit up with a number he did not know, and the voice on the other end was cold enough to cut. Madeline Whitmore did not introduce herself so much as accuse. She knew a man had stopped for her mother. She wanted to know what he had done to the car, what he wanted, how much he thought this little performance was going to earn him. In her world, every stranger had an angle, and she had already decided what his was before he said a word. Caleb let her finish. He had spent years being the thing people assumed the worst about, and he had learned that arguing only fed it. So instead of defending himself, he simply described what he had seen, the placement of the cuts, the way each one had been dressed to mimic ordinary failure, the specific skill it took to sabotage a car, so that the sabotage itself stayed invisible. He spoke plainly, without drama, the way a man reads out a diagnosis. And on the other end of the line, something in Madeline went very still, because he was describing something no ordinary mechanic could have seen, let alone named. The certainty in his voice unsettled her more than any threat could have. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had said something she could not immediately dismiss or price, and the silence that followed his words belonged to her, not him. When she finally spoke again, her voice had lost its edge, though she would have died before admitting it. "Stay where you are," she said. "I'm coming to you." She arrived the next morning in a car worth more than the building it parked beside, and she brought two things, a large sum of money and a non-disclosure agreement already drawn up, already signed on the company's side. It was the reflex of her whole career. Find the problem, seal it. Pay for silence. Move on before the thing could grow teeth. She laid the paperwork on his workbench beside the landlord's notice, not knowing what the second document was, and told him plainly that whatever he thought he had seen, it would be simpler for everyone if he let it go. Caleb looked at the money for a long moment. He needed it. The notice under the wrench said exactly how much he needed it, set it in a number that could keep the roof over the only life he had left. And then he pushed the paperwork back across the bench toward her. "This isn't a broken car," he said. "Somebody engineered a way to kill your mother and make it look like an old Cadillac giving up. I'm not going to sign my name to a lie about it, and I'm not going to take your money to forget I saw it." He said it without heat, which was somehow worse because it left her nothing to argue against. Madeline had built her entire understanding of people on the belief that everyone had a price. She had bought silence from executives, from journalists, from men far more powerful than the one standing in front of her in a stained work shirt. And here was a man with a repossession notice on his own bench, turning down the exact amount of money that could save him because a stranger's mother mattered more to him than his own roof. It did not fit anything she knew, and Madeline Whitmore had learned long ago to pay attention to the things that did not fit. What decided her in the end was not his goodness. It was the logic underneath the fear. An attack that precise engineered to hide inside the ordinary failures of a car was not the work of some outside stranger. It required knowledge of how Whitmore vehicles were built, access to systems most of the world never saw. Whoever had done this had come from inside her own house. The traitor was somewhere in her company, perhaps in her own boardroom, and that meant she could not trust a single engineer or advisor who drew a paycheck from Whitmore Motors, which left her exactly one person. Caleb was the only man who had seen the sabotage for what it was, and the only one with no stake in the politics eating at her from within. He owed nothing to the board, wanted nothing from the launch, had no way to profit from the truth. More than that, the way he had read the damage had begun to make her suspect that the man in front of her had once been something far more than a small-town mechanic. He was the one neutral instrument she had left, and she had run out of the luxury of pride. "I have a problem," she said finally, and it cost her to say it, the admission landing in the quiet garage like a tool dropped on concrete. "Something is wrong inside my company, and I can't trust anyone who works for me to help me find it, because for all I know, one of them built the thing that almost killed my mother." She looked at him then, not as a CEO looks at a contractor, but as one cornered person looks at another. "You saw it when no one else could. I'm asking you to help me see the rest." For Caleb, the request opened a door he had spent years nailing shut. The corporate world had taken everything from him once had framed him, discarded him, left him to rot in a garage, while the men responsible went on with their lives. Every instinct he had built since then told him to stay away from towers of glass and people who signed non-disclosure agreements before they said good morning. To walk back through that door was to risk being destroyed all over again by the same machine. But there was the wiring cut exactly the way his life had been cut all those years ago. There was the old woman who had looked at him like he was still worth something. And there was the quiet, unwelcome truth that a part of him had been waiting a long time for a reason to be that man again, the one who could read a machine and find the lie hidden inside it. "If I do this," Caleb said at last, "I do it my way. I don't sign your agreement. I don't take your hush money. And if I find something, you don't get to bury it because it's inconvenient." He held her gaze, and for the first time, Madeline saw that the calm in him was not weakness, but a kind of iron. Somebody spent a lot of skill trying to make a murder look like bad luck. I've spent years being the man everybody blamed for something he didn't do. I'd like to be on the other side of that for once. Madeline extended her hand across the workbench, over the money she was already gathering back up over the unsigned agreement she would not mention again. "Then we understand each other," she said. It was not warmth. She did not have warmth to spare, not yet. But it was something rarer from her, which was respect offered to a man. Her whole world would have told her to look straight through. Caleb took her hand. His grip was firm and unhurried, the grip of a man who had nothing left to prove and therefore nothing to fake. And Madeline felt the strangeness of shaking hands with someone who genuinely could not be bought. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and thin light was pushing through the gray. She left him her private number and a promise that a copy of everything from the Cadillac would be waiting for him by nightfall. As her car pulled out of the lot, Caleb stood in the doorway the way he always did, but for the first time in a long while he was not waiting for a future that never came. Somewhere in this city, a man had tried to kill an old woman with a screwdriver and a laptop and make the world call it fate. He did not yet know how far it went, or that the road he had just agreed to walk led straight back into the wreckage of his own ruined name. He knew only what the wiring had told him, and the wiring did not lie. Whatever came next, it had already begun. The Whitmore Motors headquarters was everything Caleb had spent years teaching himself to hate, and walking back into a building like it felt like pressing on an old wound to see if it still hurt. It did. The engineers in their pressed shirts looked at his work boots and the grease worn permanently into his hands, and he watched the conclusions form on their faces before he had said a single word. To them, he was a mechanic Madeline had dragged in off the street, a curiosity, a whim of a CEO under too much pressure to think straight. No one made that judgment more openly than Leonard Ashcroft. As chairman of the board, he had a chairman's gift for cruelty, dressed as concern, and he used it on Caleb from the first meeting. He wondered aloud in front of the whole room whether the company had really come to hiring roadside repairmen to audit a billion-dollar program. He suggested with a thin smile that perhaps Madeline's judgment had been clouded by gratitude for the man who had helped her mother. Every word was designed to make Caleb small, and every word was seconded quietly by the company's legal counsel, Gavin Hollis, who said little but wrote everything down. Caleb let it wash over him. He had been the most disrespected man in far worse rooms than this, and he had learned that the surest way to answer contempt was to be right in front of the people paying it. So while Ashcroft performed for the board, Caleb worked. He asked for a copy of the Cadillac's control unit and got it that first night exactly as Madeline had promised, and he took it apart the way he took everything apart, slowly, completely without assumptions. What he found in the Cadillac's electronic control unit turned the cold suspicion in his gut into something certain. The tampering was not crude. Someone had reached into the car's software and rewritten the way it reported its own health, so that a failure engineered from the outside would read to any inspector as an internal fault. The car had simply developed on its own. It was elegant, patient, deeply skilled work, and Caleb had seen its fingerprints before. He had seen them in the evidence that ended his career in the fabricated data that made him look like a man who leaked secrets he had never touched. He sat with that recognition for a long time in a borrowed office after the building had emptied. The same hand, the same signature. The certainty of it was almost physical, two separate wounds turning out to be the work of the same knife. Then he pulled the diagnostic logs from the Aurora X development fleet, the self-driving line the whole company was about to stake its future on, and his blood ran cold. The faults beginning to surface in Aurora X, small, intermittent, easy to dismiss, carried the same architecture as the cuts in Eleanor's Cadillac. The old woman's car had not been the target. It had been a rehearsal. Bringing that to Madeline meant working beside her, and the two of them scraped against each other from the start. She was used to command, to giving instructions, and having them followed without discussion, and Caleb had spent too many years answering to no one to fall into line for anybody. She wanted answers on her schedule. He gave them when the work was done and not before. She wanted control of a problem that would not be controlled, and he refused to hand her the illusion of it. It came to a head one night in the lab, the two of them alone with the disassembled units and the glow of a dozen screens. Madeline pushed him for a conclusion he was not ready to give, and when he would not perform certainty, he did not feel her temper slipped its leash. She told him she had brought him in to solve a problem, not to test her patience, and Caleb, tired and unguarded, told her the truth as he saw it. "You treat everyone in this building like a suspect," he said evenly. "Every person who works for you is guilty until they prove otherwise. That's why you're standing in here at 2 a.m. with a mechanic, because you burned every bridge that could have helped you carry this." The words landed exactly where he had aimed, and he regretted the aim the moment he saw them hit. Something crossed Madeline's face that he had not seen there before. A flinch beneath the armor quickly covered. She did not fire back. She gathered her things and left, and Caleb stood alone with the machines and the unpleasant knowledge that he had wounded a woman for the crime of being as scarred as he was. She did not sleep that night, but she did not spend it nursing the wound either. Instead, she did what she always did, with a threat she could not name. She went looking for its shape. Quietly using channels that answered to her alone, Madeline pulled the buried history of the man in her lab, and what she found did not match the record. The public story painted Caleb Turner as a disgraced engineer who had leaked proprietary data and been rightly cast out. But the deeper she dug, the more the story frayed. The evidence against him had appeared too suddenly and too complete. He had not been a fraud. He had been a brilliant engineer, and he had been destroyed on purpose. She came to him with the file the next evening, and something in her had changed. There was no command in her now, only a careful uncertainty as she set what she had found on the table between them and asked him quietly to tell her what had really happened. And so, Caleb told her. He told her about the project he had been leading, the anomalies he had started to report, the way the ground had opened under him the moment he got close to something someone wanted hidden. He told her how thorough the framing had been, how the same industry that had once flown him across the country had closed its doors in a single week and left him with a set of tools and a ruined name. What Madeline did next surprised them both. She lowered her own guard, the guard she had held up so long she had forgotten it was a choice. She told him about her father, about inheriting a company, at an age when the board still saw a grieving daughter, instead of a chief executive, about the years she had spent proving herself to men who had already decided she would fail. She told him the truth she had never said aloud, that she trusted no one, because the one time she had it had cost her, and that the coldness everyone accused her of was not cruelty, but the scar tissue over a wound she had stopped letting anyone see. Two people the same machine had tried to grind down had found each other in a lab at midnight, and the reluctant respect between them turned in that conversation into something warmer and far more dangerous trust. It was not comfortable for either of them. Trust was the thing that had cost them both so much. But sitting there with the file open and the truth finally spoken, they each recognized in the other a person who understood exactly what it was to be broken by people with power, and who had refused against all sense to break all the way. Out of that recognition came a colder clarity. They laid the two stories side by side, the sabotage that had ended Caleb's career and the sabotage now threading itself through Whitmore Motors, and they saw the same intelligence at work in both. This was not two crimes. It was one stretched across years. The same force that had destroyed Caleb to bury a secret was now moving against the company itself. Their purpose shifted from protecting a single car to something far larger, exposing whoever had spent years pulling strings inside Whitmore Motors and dragging them into the light. Their enemies did not wait to be found. Leonard Ashcroft had spent a career sensing threats before they matured, and he moved against Caleb the way he moved against everything through others at a distance, with deniability built in. The old scandal surfaced in the press, again dressed up for a new audience. Stories ran describing Caleb as a failed engineer, with a grudge, a disgraced man who had wormed his way close to a vulnerable CEO for his own ends. Gavin Hollis's fingerprints were nowhere on it, and everywhere in it the legal counsel's careful hand, visible to anyone who knew how these things were done. The pressure came at Caleb from every direction at once. The landlord's patience already gone hardened into action, and the repossession of the garage was accelerated, the last thread of his old life cut on a schedule too convenient to be chance. He understood with grim clarity that they were trying to leave him nowhere to stand. No home. No name. Nothing left to lose that had not already been taken. It was the same play as before, and knowing the choreography did not make it hurt less to watch it begin again. Madeline was no safer. Whispers moved through the board that she had lost her judgment, that the Aurora X launch was slipping, that a founder's daughter had finally proven she could not carry her father's company. Ashcroft fed each whisper without ever appearing to, and for the first time the possibility of losing the company entirely stopped being unthinkable and started being a plan she could see forming aimed directly at her. But the investigation kept moving because they had found an ally the two of them had underestimated. Eleanor Whitmore had spent years letting the world forget she existed, and that quiet had become a kind of armor. When she learned what was happening to her company, and to the man who had stopped for her in the rain, She stepped forward not as a victim, but as a founder. She still held keys that no one else did, and she used them. It was Eleanor who opened the door they had not been able to force. Deep in the founder-level archives and systems Leonard Ashcroft believed had been wiped clean years ago, there were old records. Only she had the authority to reach system logs from the earliest days of the company, kept for reasons no one now remembered. She granted Caleb access to them herself, sitting across from him, with the same directness she had shown on the rain-soaked road. People have spent their whole lives underestimating an old woman and a man who works with his hands, she told him. That has always been their mistake, and I intend to make it their last. Inside those archives, Caleb began pulling threads that no one had meant to leave behind. He traced the digital signature buried in the sabotage code, the small habits of style that every author leaves in their work, whether they mean to or not. And slowly, the trail narrowed from the whole company toward a source inside it. The picture was not yet complete. He did not yet have the single piece that would name the man beyond any doubt, but it was tightening, and he could feel it tightening, the way he had once felt a diagnosis come together under his hands. And then he found what the whole design had been building toward. Hidden in the Aurora X code, dormant and waiting, was a piece of malware set to trigger, not during testing, but on launch day itself, in front of the world. It would drive the entire self-driving line to fail publicly and catastrophically at the exact moment of the company's greatest exposure, and the collapse of Whitmore stock that followed would not be an accident either. Someone intended to crash the company's value on cue and buy the wreckage for pennies. Killing Eleanor had served two purposes at once. It would test the weapon on a real car, and it would remove a founding shareholder whose vote and voice could still stand in the way. But the company itself was the prize. Caleb understood the full shape of it. At last, sitting in the glow of the archives with Eleanor's logs open before him. This was not revenge, and it was not politics. It was theft on a scale that required a company to be destroyed, so it could be swallowed. And the man who had ended Caleb's career years ago had done so to protect exactly this, to keep his hands hidden while the trap was built. The past and the present were not two stories after all. They were one long crime, and Caleb was finally close enough to see the whole of it. He brought it all to Madeline, and for a moment, the sheer scale of what they were facing sat in the room with them like a third presence. They had the outline of the conspiracy, the shape of the malware, the narrowing trail toward its source. What they did not have was time or safety or a single institution on their side. The board was turning against Madeline. The press was turning against Caleb. The launch was days away, and the weapon was already inside the machine. For all of that, something had changed between them that could not be taken by any board or any headline. They were no longer a CEO and the mechanic she had hired. Caleb watched Madeline read the malware analysis, watched the fear and the resolve war across a face she no longer bothered to keep armored in front of him, and he understood that whatever happened next, he was not walking back through this fire alone. "They think they've already won," Madeline said quietly, not looking up from the screen. "They think if they take the company from me and the name from you, there won't be anyone left standing to say what really happened." She raised her eyes to his. Then, and there was steel in them again, but a different steel warmed by something she had spent years refusing to feel. "They're wrong about that. They've been wrong about both of us for a long time." Caleb almost smiled. Outside the window, the city was going dark, and somewhere below them, Leonard Ashcroft was moving pieces across a board he believed he controlled completely. He did not know that the man he had thrown away years ago had come all the way back, or that an old woman he had dismissed still held the keys to his undoing. For the first time since the rain, Caleb felt the old certainty settle over him, clean and sharp as the cuts in Eleanor's wiring. They were close, and the men who had spent years hiding in the dark were about to learn what it felt like to be found. The blow they had been bracing for landed the night before the board meeting, and it landed exactly where it would hurt most. Caleb was in the borrowed office late, cross-checking the malware analysis against Eleanor's archives, when the screens in front of him went dark one by one. The server that held everything they had, built the traced signatures, the recovered logs, the map of the whole conspiracy, was being wiped clean from somewhere far away. He watched weeks of work dissolve in seconds and knew with a sick certainty that Gavin Hollis had finally reached in and pulled the floor out from under them. He called Madeline, and she came, and for a while the two of them stood in the wreck of it without speaking. Everything was gone. The board would convene in the morning to remove her. The press had already turned Caleb into a cautionary tale. The garage was days from being taken, and now the evidence that could have saved all of it had been erased by a single remote command. It was the same ending as before, the same machine closing over the same man, and this time it was closing over her too. For one long moment, it truly seemed that they had lost. In the dark of that office, something happened that neither of them had planned for. Madeline, who had carried every weight of her life alone, who had built a fortress out of doing everything herself, looked at the man beside her and admitted she could not do this one without him. And then she said the thing she had been carrying since the morning she laid a non-disclosure agreement on his workbench. "I'm sorry," she told him. "The first time I met you, I tried to buy your silence like you were a problem to be managed. You were the only honest thing in this whole mess, and I treated you like everyone else." The apology cost her, and Caleb understood exactly what it had cost. He let the quiet hold for a moment before he answered, because what he was about to say deserved the weight. "They didn't erase everything," he said. Madeline turned to him, not understanding, and Caleb allowed himself the smallest, grimmest measure of satisfaction. Years of being framed had taught him one lesson. Above all others, never trust a single copy of anything. Never leave the truth somewhere another man could reach it. The night Whitmore first handed him the Cadillac's control unit, before he had touched anything else, he had pulled a complete offline image of it and locked it away where no network could reach, and he had done the same with every fragment he uncovered afterward. Gavin had wiped the server. He had never known there was a second copy sitting entirely off the grid. It was not a rescue. It was a beginning. What sat on that offline drive was raw, the original tampered code, the first fragments of the signature, the untouched logs from the car itself. To turn it into something a boardroom could not deny, they had one night to rebuild the entire chain of proof from the ground up, to reconstruct what had taken weeks and do it before the sun came up. They worked without stopping, Caleb at the machines, and Madeline beside him feeding him every record Eleanor's access could still reach. And somewhere in those hours, the last distance between them closed for good. This was a victory they would have to earn cut by cut, and they earned it together. The board convened the next morning in the tower's largest room, and Leonard Ashcroft had staged it like a man who already knew the verdict. He had called the meeting under the pretense of addressing the company's instability, but its real purpose was written in every arrangement of the room. This was the day he would remove Madeline and finish Caleb, and he had summoned Caleb there specifically to serve as the example. The disgraced engineer, the failed man preying on a vulnerable CEO, dragged before the board to be paraded and dismissed. Ashcroft opened by inviting the members to see for themselves the kind of person Madeline had let into the heart of their company. He never got to finish the performance. The doors at the back of the room opened, and Eleanor Whitmore walked in. Most of the board had not seen her in years, had half forgotten she still existed, and they certainly had not expected the founder's widow to appear at the meeting meant to end her daughter's control of the company her husband had built. She crossed the room without hurry, and when she spoke, it was with the quiet authority of someone who had helped create everything they were sitting inside. She invoked the founder's shares she still held, and the board seat she had almost never used, the very authority that had been mentioned in passing when she was only a stranded old woman in the rain, and she claimed the floor for the man Ashcroft had brought there to destroy. "You'll hear him," Eleanor said, and it was not a request. "You brought him here to be humiliated. You'll listen to him instead." Leonard Ashcroft's face did something complicated, the confidence in it cracking for the first time, because a plan built on everyone knowing their place had just met the one person in the building who outranked him and had chosen this moment to remember it. He tried to object on procedure, and Gavin Hollis reached for the rules. But the shares were real, and the seat was real, and the room, sensing the shift, went silent to hear what the mechanic had to say. Caleb stood, and for the first time in years, he was not a man defending himself against an accusation. He was an engineer again in front of the only audience that mattered, and he had the truth in his hands. He connected the offline drive he had guarded from the beginning and began to rebuild the case in front of them, live on the screens that filled the wall. He showed them the tampering in Eleanor's Cadillac, the code rewritten to disguise a murder as a mechanical failure. He showed them the identical architecture waiting inside Aurora X, the malware set to trigger on launch day and take the company down in front of the world. Then he showed them who had done it. From the reconstructed logs, he pulled the digital signatures, the dashcam records, the access trails that no wiped server could unwrite, because he had kept the source beyond their reach. One by one, the threads converged on two men, and the room followed each one to its end. The signature in the sabotage code, the authorizations that should never have existed, the pattern that stretched back years, all of it, pointed at Leonard Ashcroft, with Gavin Hollis's careful hand at work beside him at every step. And woven through it, undeniable now, was the older crime, the framing that had destroyed Caleb's career to protect the very plan now unfolding. The two stories the board had thought were separate closed into one before their eyes. Ashcroft rose to fight it, because men like him always did. And for a moment, he tried to turn the room the way he had turned it for years, with contempt, with authority, with the assumption that no one would take the word of a mechanic over the chairman of the board. But the evidence on the wall did not care about his authority, and the faces around the table had already begun to change. He looked at the end less like a powerful man than a cornered one, and when he understood that the room had finally seen him clearly, the fight went out of him. The conspiracy to seize Whitmore Motors and the years of hidden crime that had built it stood exposed in front of the whole board. What followed came quickly, the way these things do once the truth is loose in a room. Leonard Ashcroft lost everything he had spent years accumulating: his seat, his power, his standing, and the evidence Caleb had rebuilt became the foundation of a criminal investigation that would follow him out of the building. Gavin Hollis was suspended, the careful hand finally caught in the open, his own meticulous records now turned into proof against him. The Aurora X launch was halted, not out of defeat, but out of responsibility, so that every corrupted line of code could be found and stripped from the system before a single car carried it onto a public road. For Caleb, the vindication arrived in a form he had stopped letting himself imagine. Whitmore Motors publicly, and without hedging, cleared his name, stated plainly that the man the industry had cast out years ago had been framed, that the scandal that ruined him had been a lie built to protect the same people now facing prosecution. The record that had followed him into every locked door and every pitying glance was corrected at last, not in a whisper, but in front of the world that had believed the worst of him. He had spent years being the man everyone blamed. He was not that man anymore, and now everyone knew it. Madeline offered him a place at the center of the company he had saved. She asked him to become the Director of Engineering Safety for Whitmore Motors and Office, a title the full return to the world that had once thrown him away. It was everything the version of him from years ago would have wanted handed to him by the woman who had come to trust him more than she trusted anyone. And Caleb, standing in the tower that had terrified him the day he first walked into it, understood that he did not want it. He turned the position down, and he did it without bitterness. He had learned in the wreckage of his first life and the strange gift of his second that he was not made to be swallowed back into a building of glass and pressed shirts, that the man he had become in that small garage was a man he did not want to trade for a title. He would not give up who he was for the honor of belonging to the thing that had once destroyed him. Madeline, who a month earlier would not have understood that choice, understood it, now completely, so they built something else instead. Rather than absorb Caleb into the company, Madeline signed a partnership with his garage, turning the small shop at the end of the cracked lot into the independent safety verification center for Whitmore Motors. The place that had been days from repossession, the building whose crooked steel door never closed straight, became the one facility that stood outside the company's walls and answered to no one inside them, the last check between a Whitmore vehicle and the road. The garage that the whole industry had looked straight through became an address that same industry learned to respect. The relationship between Caleb and Madeline had traveled a long way to arrive where it did. It had begun in suspicion in a cold phone call at midnight and a non-disclosure agreement on a workbench, and it had passed through every hard stage between the contempt, the collisions, the slow discovery that beneath the armor, they were the same two people who had been ground down and had somehow held on to who they were. What stood between them now was not spoken and did not need to be. It was warmth and trust and the quiet possibility of something more, left open and unhurried the way real things are. Madeline had changed in ways the board would spend years catching up to. She had learned the lesson her father's death and her own hard climb had hidden from her, that the worth of a person had nothing to do with their title or the shirt they wore, that trusting the right person was not the weakness she had spent her life guarding against, but the very thing that had saved her company, and in a way she was only beginning to understand, saved her. The woman who had trusted no one now knew the difference between a knife and a hand extended in the dark. Eleanor, for her part, never let the world forget again what an old woman was capable of when she decided to stop being overlooked. She held Caleb in the regard of a true partner, the man who had stopped on a rain-soaked road for a stranger, and in doing so had pulled the whole company back from a disaster no one else had seen coming. She had known something about him from the first night, from the way he closed her fingers over money he would not take, and she had been right about him in a way that had cost their enemies everything. On a gray afternoon, weeks later, Caleb stood in the doorway of his garage, the way he always had, watching the light move across the lot. The folded repossession notice was long gone from under the wrench, replaced by the paperwork of a partnership he could not have imagined the night he first opened the hood of a stranger's Cadillac. His name was his own again. The men who had taken it were answering for what they had done, and the small shop at the end of the wrong side of Detroit had become the one place in the whole industry where the truth about a machine could not be bought buried or made to look like an accident. He had stopped that night for no reason other than that no one else would, and it had cost him a little rain and a little time. From that one small, unremarkable act of decency, the whole design of a conspiracy had come undone. A company had been saved, and a man the world had discarded had been given back everything it took. Caleb picked up his wrench, turned back toward the work, and let the door stay open behind him. The truth had taken years to prove, but it had been proved the only way that ever lasted. Not with words, but with what a man was willing to do when he thought no one important was watching. Never measure a person's worth by their appearance or their standing. Integrity, kindness, and real ability can be buried for a time, but the truth is proven in the end by what a person does. Sometimes, a single small act of decency, one that seems to cost almost nothing, can change the fate of many lives and protect something far greater than reputation or money.